By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe had transformed bomber interception into industrial-scale slaughter. The German fighter force defending the Reich was no collection of amateurs. These were seasoned combat veterans, men who'd survived the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, and 2 years of increasingly brutal air combat over Western Europe. They flew with tactical sophistication that American bomber crews, many on their first or second missions, could barely comprehend. Jagdgeschwader 26, the Abbeville boys, had been mauling Allied bombers since 1940. JG-1, JG-11, and JG-2 fielded pilots with hundreds of combat sorties and dozens of kills. They didn't just intercept bombers, they dissected them with clinical precision, exploiting every weakness in American defensive doctrine. The tactics were refined through blood and repetition. Company front attacks, 8 Focke-Wulf 190s approaching line, abreast at 400 mpm, saturating defensive fire with multiple simultaneous targets. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high, diving through formations faster than turret gunners could track. Attacks from below, where belly turrets had limited traverse. The Luftwaffe had turned aerial combat into applied geometry, and the equation always ended with American bombers burning. August 17, 1943, proved the system worked with devastating efficiency. The mission, strike the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt plants at Regensburg, required the deepest penetration into Germany, yet attempted. The plan was audacious. 376 B-17 flying fortresses, split into 2 waves, would cripple Germany's industrial capacity in a single afternoon. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Over Schweinfurt, German fighters attacked in waves, 20, 30 aircraft at a time, pressing attacks through murderous defensive fire. They struck the formations before the bomb runs, during the bombing, and throughout the long withdrawal. B-17s fell in pieces, exploded in midair, or spiraled down trailing fire and men. Parachutes blossomed across the German countryside like strange white flowers. The Americans lost 60 bombers that day, 552 aircrew killed or captured. Another 55 bombers returned so badly damaged they required weeks of repair. It was the highest loss rate of the war, and it exposed a fundamental, fatal flaw in American strategic bombing doctrine. The escort fighters couldn't follow. Republic P-47. Thunderbolts, 7-ton brutes powered by massive radial engines, could reach the German border with external drop tanks. Then they turned back, fuel gauges dropping toward empty. Twin-engine P-38 Lightnings promised better range, but the European theater was destroying them. At 25,000 feet, where bomber combat occurred, temperatures plunged to -40 degrees. Allison engines seized, cockpits frosted over, control cables froze solid. Pilots returned with frostbite, if they returned at all. This created a 200-mile gap, a killing zone where American bombers flew utterly alone, deep over Germany, while Luftwaffe fighters attacked with impunity. German pilots called it Die Goldene Zeit, the golden time. They simply waited beyond P-47 range, then struck like wolves culling a herd. Some flew 3 or 4 sorties against a single bomber stream, landing only to refuel and rearm before attacking again. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids for weeks, unable to sustain the losses. When they returned to Schweinfurt on October 14th, Black Thursday, the carnage intensified. 77 bombers lost or destroyed, 600 men dead. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. Luftwaffe morale soared Their commanders spoke openly of breaking the American bombing offensive entirely. In fighter-ready rooms across Germany, pilots laughed at the predictable American formations, the helpless bombers that flew straight and level to their deaths. The sky belonged to Germany. They believed it would stay that way forever. The solution to the escort problem came from an unexpected marriage of necessity and engineering brilliance. In April 1942, Royal Air Force test pilot Ronald Harker climbed into an American-built North American Mustang at Duxford and immediately recognized something extraordinary. The airframe was aerodynamically exceptional, cleaner lines than even the legendary Spitfire, lighter, more efficient. But the Allison V1710 engine choked above 15,000 feet, rendering the aircraft useless for high-altitude bomber escort. Harker's report to Rolls-Royce was direct. Fit this aircraft with a Merlin engine. What happened next would reshape the air war over Europe. By October 1942, the first Mustang mounted with a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same two-stage supercharged engine powering Britain's most advanced fighters, took to the sky. The transformation was immediate and shocking. Maximum speed jumped from 399 mm to 441 mm. Service ceiling soared from 31,000 feet to 42,000 feet. Most critically, performance above 20,000 feet, where bomber combat occurred, shifted from marginal to dominant. But the real revolution was range. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, designed by North American's engineering team, reduced drag by nearly 30% compared to conventional designs. Combined with efficient fuel consumption, 65 gallons per hour, versus the P-47's 100 gallons, and the ability to carry external drop tanks without severe performance penalties, the P-51B could fly distances no single-engine fighter had ever achieved. With 108-gallon drop tanks, combat radius stretched to 850 miles. Berlin was 520 miles from England. The Americans ordered the aircraft in massive quantities. By November 1943, the first operational P-51Bs arrived in England, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustangs. They were rushed into combat with minimal training, testing an aircraft nobody fully understood yet. December 13, 1943, marked the first indication something had changed. The 8th Air Force dispatched bombers to Kiel, 490 miles from England, well beyond previous escort range. P-51Bs accompanied them the entire distance. German controllers, tracking the raid on radar, watched in confusion as American fighter escorts continued flying east past the point where they always turned back. Past the border. Past the golden moment. All the way to the target. Luftwaffe pilots intercepting over northern Germany expected to find exhausted bomber gunners and empty sky. Instead, they encountered fresh, aggressive American fighters spoiling for combat, deep inside Reich territory, in airspace that had been German sanctuary for 2 years. The psychological impact was immediate and unsettling. Radio intercepts from late December revealed German controllers repeatedly questioning their pilots. Confirm fighter type. Confirm position. How far inland are they? The responses grew increasingly alarmed. The escorts weren't P-47s. They weren't turning back. They were following the bombers all the way to target and engaging any Luftwaffe aircraft that approached. Major Klaus Mitusch of JG-26, after a December 30th interception, where Mustangs pursued his Focke-Wulfs to their own airfield perimeter, landed shaken. He gathered his pilots in the ready room and spoke with unusual gravity. The air war has fundamentally changed. Our sanctuary no longer exists. Intelligence reports filtered up through Luftwaffe command. A new American fighter. Exceptional range. Performance equal or superior to the FW-190 and Bf-109G at altitude. Pilots who knew how to use it. By late February 1944, more P-51B groups were arriving weekly. The 4th Fighter Group, The famous Debden Eagles, veteran Thunderbolt pilots, converted to Mustangs on February 28th. 4 days later, they would fly to Berlin. And everything Germany believed about air superiority would shatter in a single afternoon. 660 heavy bombers lifted off from airfields across East Anglia, their formations darkening the morning sky. The target, Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, the city Hermann Göring had sworn would never see enemy aircraft in daylight. 520 miles from England, deep in the heart of Nazi Germany. This time, the bombers weren't going alone. 73 P-51 Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group climbed to escort altitude, their silver fuselages gleaming in the winter sun. Colonel Donald Blakesley, leading the mission, keyed his radio. "Stick with the bombers all the way. Today we're going to Berlin." 4 days earlier, these pilots had been flying P-47 Thunderbolts. Now they were about to accomplish what every Luftwaffe commander believed was aerodynamically impossible. Over Brandenburg, German radar operators watched in growing confusion. The massive bomber stream showed clearly on their scopes: standard American tactics, predictable heading, obvious target. But the escort fighters weren't turning back. They passed the point where P-47s always reversed course. They crossed deeper into Germany, still flying, still climbing. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled every available fighter. Over 200 Bf-109s and FRW-190s climbed to intercept, their pilots expecting the usual scenario. Exhausted bomber gunners, no fighter opposition, easy kills over the Reich's capital. What they found instead was a nightmare. At 25,000 feet over Berlin, Oberleutnant Heinz Baer of JG-1 led his Schwarm toward what appeared to be vulnerable bomber formations. Then he saw them, sleek, angular fighters weaving protective patterns around the B-17s. American markings, fresh, aggressive, over Berlin. The Mustangs didn't wait to be attacked. They dove into the climbing German formations, breaking up coordinated attacks before they could develop. What followed was chaos, a swirling, brutal dogfight over the Reich's capital, exactly the scenario Luftwaffe doctrine had been designed to avoid. The P-51Bs held every advantage. They had altitude, they had speed, they had fuel reserves after flying 520 miles. The German pilots, by contrast, had burned precious fuel, just climbing to intercept altitude from their forward bases. The hunters had become the hunted. The 4th Fighter Group claimed 15 German fighters destroyed. More importantly, dozens of bomber attacks were disrupted, scattered, or abandoned entirely. German pilots found themselves fighting for their lives against a fighter that could turn with the Bf-109, dive with the FW-190, and outrun both in level flight. Some Luftwaffe pilots, spotting the Mustangs and recognizing the tactical impossibility of their presence, simply disengaged and fled. The bombers struck Berlin and turned for home, still escorted. The psychological impact was catastrophic. That evening, across Luftwaffe bases throughout Germany, pilots sat in stunned silence. Berlin, the one city that was supposed to be safe, unreachable by enemy fighters, had been penetrated. The golden moment had vanished. Gun camera footage from the mission reached Luftwaffe High Command within days. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal who had promised Berlin would never be bombed, watched American fighters maneuver over Brandenburg. His response, recorded by staff officers present, was resigned and bitter. If they can escort fighters to Berlin, the war is finished. He was right. The Luftwaffe didn't collapse overnight. It would take months of grinding attrition. But March 4th, 1944, marked the moment German air superiority became strategically irrelevant. The Americans had solved the unsolvable problem. Geography no longer protected the Reich. Every German pilot now understood there was nowhere left to hide. The bombers could reach any target in Germany, and the Mustangs would follow them all the way. In January 1944, Lieutenant General James "Jimmy" Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force and issued an order that transformed American fighter doctrine. Destroy the enemy air force wherever you find it, in the air, on the ground, in the factories. The Mustangs were no longer defensive escorts. They were hunters. Doolittle unleashed them with devastating effect. P-51 groups were authorized to leave bomber formations, pursue fleeing German fighters to their airfields, and strafe anything that moved. Luftwaffe bases that had been sanctuaries, where pilots could land, refuel, and launch again in safety, became killing zones. American fighters caught German aircraft at their most vulnerable. Gear down, flaps extended, slow and heavy during takeoff and landing. Mustangs orbited known Luftwaffe fields, waiting like hawks. Me-262 jets, Germany's revolutionary turbine-powered fighters, were hunted relentlessly during their approach patterns when their engines couldn't accelerate quickly. Dozens were destroyed within sight of their own runways. But the Mustangs did more than shoot down aircraft. They strafed locomotives, shredding Germany's logistics network. They destroyed fuel trucks, ammunition depots, and repair facilities. They attacked factories during shift changes. The campaign was systematic, relentless, industrial in scale. Then came the targeting of Germany's synthetic fuel production. Allied bombers, now escorted throughout their missions, began striking hydrogenation plants, the chemical facilities that converted coal into aviation fuel. In May 1944, Germany produced 175,000 tons of aviation gasoline. By September, production had collapsed to 10,000 tons, a 94% reduction in 4 months. The Luftwaffe was being starved. German fighter units received fuel allocations measured in hours, enough for 1 or 2 sorties per day, sometimes less. Training schools shut down entirely. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with 50 hours of flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone survive combat against American pilots with hundreds of hours and growing combat experience. The attrition mathematics became insurmountable. Experienced German aces, the men who dominated European skies for years, died faster than they could be replaced. Günter Rahl, Adolf Galland, Heinz Behr survived, but dozens of their peers with 50, 100, 150 victories didn't. Each lost ace represented irreplaceable tactical knowledge, hundreds of hours of combat experience, and the institutional memory of how to fight effectively. By summer 1944, kill ratios reached 10-1 in favor of American fighters. Some missions saw ratios of 15.1 or 21. It wasn't combat anymore, it was slaughter. German pilots began refusing to engage. Radio intercepts captured Luftwaffe controllers, desperately ordering fighters to attack bomber formations, only to hear silence or excuses. Pilots who did engage often broke off after a single pass, fleeing before Mustangs could respond. Luftwaffe morale, once unshakable, fractured completely. The impact cascaded through Germany's entire defensive system. Without air cover, flak batteries became the only defense against strategic bombing. But flak was static, predictable, and far less effective than fighters. American bomber losses dropped from 6-8% per mission in 1943 to 2-3% in late 1944. The bombing offensive, nearly broken at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, now proceeded with industrial efficiency. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe existed primarily on paper. Squadrons were staffed but grounded for lack of fuel. Aircraft sat idle, cannibalized for parts. Pilots with minimal training flew planes they barely understood against an enemy that owned the sky. The once proud German fighter force, the organization that had terrorized Europe, destroyed hundreds of Allied bombers, and dominated aerial combat for years, had become a ghost, present in organizational charts, absent from the battlefield. German industry still produced fighters. German engineers still designed revolutionary aircraft. But none of it mattered anymore. The Luftwaffe had been bled white, and the weapon that killed it was a fighter born from Anglo-American collaboration, powered by a British engine, and flown by American pilots who could reach anywhere in Europe. The sky no longer belonged to Germany. It never would again. In the years following the war, something remarkable occurred at airshows and veteran reunions across Europe and America. Former enemies met, shook hands, and spoke honestly about the aircraft that had changed everything. Adolf Galland, the legendary Luftwaffe General der Jagdflieger, who'd commanded Germany's fighter forces, was asked by an American interviewer what single development had been most decisive in Germany's defeat. His answer was immediate and unequivocal: the P-51 Mustang. Günther Rahl, third highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, put it even more bluntly during a 1970s reunion with American pilots. When we saw Mustangs over Berlin, we knew it was over. Not eventually. Immediately. You had solved the one problem we thought was unsolvable. These weren't bitter admissions. They were statements of professional respect. Acknowledgement that the Mustang represented something beyond tactics or courage. It represented the triumph of engineering innovation and industrial capacity over tactical brilliance and individual skill. The P-51's legacy extends far beyond its combat record. It became a symbol of what cross-national collaboration could achieve. British engineering expertise, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, married to American mass production capability and airframe design. Neither nation could have created the P-51B alone. Together, they built the weapon that won the air war. The Mustang also validated a fundamental principle of modern warfare. Wars are won in factories as much as on battlefields. Germany fielded brilliant aircraft designers, exceptional pilots, and revolutionary technologies like jet engines and guided missiles. But they couldn't mass-produce them. They couldn't fuel them. They couldn't replace losses faster than they accumulated. America could. By war's end, North American Aviation and its contractors had built over 15,000 P-51s. German factories, under relentless bombing and fuel starvation, struggled to produce hundreds of aircraft monthly. The mathematics were insurmountable, not because German engineers were inferior, but because industrial capacity and resource access determined outcomes more than ideology or individual heroism. The P-51 didn't just escort bombers. It rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. It proved that range wasn't a fixed limitation, but an engineering problem waiting to be solved. It demonstrated that combining the best ideas from multiple nations produced superior results to isolated nationalist development. It showed that strategic bombing, written off as unsustainable after Black Thursday, could succeed when supported by proper fighter escort. Most importantly, it confirmed that modern wars are decided by systems, production capacity, logistical networks, fuel supplies, training pipelines, and technological innovation, not by courage or tactics alone. German pilots were among the most skilled combat aviators in history. German aircraft were often technologically superior. German tactics were refined through years of combat experience. None of it mattered when they couldn't fuel their aircraft, couldn't train replacement pilots, and couldn't defend their own airspace. The lesson is stark and enduring. In industrial age warfare, superior engineering, robust production, and sustained innovation defeat tactical excellence every time. Courage matters. Skill matters. But logistics, resources, and the ability to translate scientific knowledge into manufactured reality matter more. The P-51 Mustang, conceived by British insight, engineered by American designers, powered by a British engine, and mass-produced by democratic industrial capitalism, proved that collaborative innovation defeats isolated brilliance. It's a lesson that echoes across every conflict since. The side that builds better, produces faster, and innovates more aggressively doesn't just win battles. It rewrites the rules of war itself, and forces its enemies to fight a war they can no longer win, in skies they no longer control, against forces they can no longer match. That's the Mustang's true legacy, not just victory, but the demonstration that in modern war, industrial democracy defeats authoritarianism not through ideology, but through measurable, undeniable, crushing material superiority.